1889, her father buried her alive. What clawed out of the coffin? 3 days later, wasn't her under the dim glow of an oil lamp. The year was 1889, and the winds over the Ohio Valley carried whispers of a tragedy that no one dared to speak aloud. In a small rural town, wrapped in superstition and silence, a father was said to have buried his own daughter alive. But what terrified the townsfolk even more was not the act itself. It was what came after. Because weeks later, when the coffin was unearthed, what they found inside was something no longer human, no longer hers. This is not a ghost story meant to frighten you for amusement. It's a fragment of forgotten history, a story erased from church records and family journals, buried beneath the soil of guilt and fear. And before this tale ends, you will understand why no one in that town ever spoke her name again. The story begins with a man named Elias Ward, a widowed farmer whose faith had rotted into obsession. His daughter Clara was 16, gentle, devout and frail since birth. Neighbors often heard her singing hymns near the willow tree by the creek, her voice carrying across the fields like a prayer lost to the wind. But when the sickness came, the fever that took half the county, Elias began to change. He claimed to see shadows near her bed, to hear voices whispering that his daughter had been touched by the devil. The preacher tried to intervene. The doctor begged him to seek reason. But Elias believed he had been chosen by God to purge his home of evil. And one autumn evening, as thunder rolled over the valley, he gathered his neighbors, dug a grave beside the willow tree, and sealed his daughter inside a wooden coffin while she still breathed. They say the screams could be heard for miles. They say the sound of nails being hammered into the lid echoed like gunfire through the rain. And when it was over, Elias fell to his knees and prayed for forgiveness, though some swore he was smiling. But this story does not end with death. For in the weeks that followed, strange things began to happen in that small Ohio town. Animals vanished from barns, lamps flickered even when the oil was fresh, and every night the same whisper drifted through the cornfields, the voice of a girl singing beneath the earth. Tonight, you will hear her story, piece by piece, from the hidden diaries, from the graveside testimonies, and from the words Elias himself carved into the church pew before he disappeared. And at the end of this video, I'll show you a document, one never released to the public, that may prove Clara Ward did not die the night she was buried. So keep watching, because what crawled out of that coffin wasn't seeking vengeance, it was seeking home. And believe me, no one in Ohio was ever the same again. The year was 1889, and Ohio stood at the uneasy crossroads between faith and fear. The Civil War had ended less than 3 decades before, but its ghosts lingered in the hearts of men. Rural towns were rebuilding from famine and disease, while superstition grew stronger than science. In these forgotten corners of America, medicine was mistrusted, and divine punishment was seen in every fever, every storm, every misfortune that visited a family too often. The town of Miller's Creek was one of those places. A handful of wooden houses scattered across the plains, a single church with a leaning steeple, and a cemetery that seemed to grow wider with every passing winter. By day, the smell of burning coal filled the air. By night, the sound of the river seemed to whisper secrets no one wanted to hear. It was a place where neighbors watched one another closely, where every sickness, every accident was said to be a curse from God, or worse, from the devil. Elias Ward had lived there his entire life. To outsiders, he was a man of discipline and prayer. But those who knew him well whispered that something inside him had broken the day his wife died in childbirth. He stopped speaking to the doctor. He stopped attending Sunday service. And by the time the fever took hold of his daughter Clara, he was no longer a man of faith. He was a man consumed by fear. The fever had spread through the Ohio Valley like wildfire, turning strong men into pale ghosts within days. Doctors called it the red lung, a form of pneumonia that suffocated its victims while they still begged for air. But to the townspeople of Miller's Creek, the illness was something else entirely. They called it the curse of the buried sin, a punishment sent to those who harbored evil beneath their roofs. And when Clara's body began to convulse, when her eyes rolled back and her voice grew hoarse from crying scripture, her father became certain she was possessed. He locked her in her room for 3 days, allowing no one to enter. The preacher, Reverend Harker, arrived on the 4th day, claiming he could hear the girl's voice praying through the door. But Elias refused him entry, shouting that God had given him a mission no other man could interfere with. The townsfolk gathered outside that night, their torches flickering in the cold wind. And through the shutters, they swore they heard the sound of something being dragged across the floor. Miller's Creek was never a place for outsiders, and those who dared question Elias soon found their barns burned or their wells fouled. Fear ruled more strongly than law, and so, when the news spread that Elias had buried his daughter alive, claiming it was the only way to save her soul, no one stopped him. They watched from the hills as he hammered the final nail into her coffin. They watched as the rain began to fall, washing away the blood from his hands. Days passed, then weeks, and strange things began to happen. The preacher's horses were found dead in the fields, their eyes wide open. A child claimed to have seen a pale figure standing by the willow tree at midnight, and Elias himself was seen wandering near the cemetery, muttering Clara's name, carrying a lantern that never seemed to burn out. It was as if the entire town had fallen under a shadow, a curse that stretched from the grave to every doorstep. Letters written by the townspeople spoke of an unease that couldn't be explained. "There's something wrong with the air," one woman wrote. "It's as if the earth itself won't stay still." And beneath that restless soil, under the weight of guilt and damp autumn earth, something was stirring. Something that should have never awakened. Clara Ward was not like the other girls of Miller's Creek. While others spent their days tending livestock or learning the hymns of obedience, Clara was drawn to the quiet, to the sound of the river, to the soft hum of wind through the cornfields. She was gentle, almost unnervingly so, with a voice that could calm a crying child or silence a quarreling crowd. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, and from that day forward, her father saw her not only as his daughter, but as a divine test, a fragile vessel that could either redeem or condemn him. Those who knew Clara described her as a child of light. She would bring bread to the sick, read verses to the lonely, and leave wildflowers at the graves of those forgotten. Yet behind her soft smile was a loneliness no one could name. Her father's love was not the warm kind that children crave. It was a cold, watchful devotion rooted in fear. Elias would spend hours reading scripture aloud to her, forcing her to repeat verses about purity and sin until her throat went raw. The preacher, Reverend Harker, often spoke of her during Sunday sermons. He said Clara's soul was a mirror, one that reflected the sins of those around her. Some called her blessed, others whispered she was cursed. Children her age avoided her out of fear that her presence brought misfortune. Even the doctor, Samuel Reddick, who once treated her for fainting spells, admitted that her pulse was so weak it felt as though her spirit was caught between two worlds. Elias, meanwhile, was a man carved from stone, rigid, silent, and haunted. Once known for his skill as a carpenter, he now spent most nights kneeling in the barn, praying aloud until his voice cracked. After his wife's death, something inside him fractured. He refused comfort from others, convinced that every misfortune was punishment from God. And when Clara's fever began, he took it as a sign, a warning that his household had been tainted. Reverend Harker tried to reason with him. "The Lord does not demand the death of the innocent," he said. But Elias's eyes were hollow, as though he were staring at something beyond the world around him. "You don't understand," he whispered. "The devil hides behind love, and she's too perfect. That's how he gets in." On the third night of her illness, Clara woke to find her father sitting beside her bed, a candle flickering between them. "Do you see it too?" he asked, his voice trembling. "The shadow behind your eyes?" She tried to reach for him, but he recoiled as if burned. In that moment, Clara realized her father no longer saw his daughter. He saw a monster that needed to be purged. When the fever broke, she begged him to let her go outside, to feel the wind, to see the willow tree again. He agreed, but not because he pitied her. He said he wanted her to face the earth she was born from. And so he led her out into the yard, where the ground was already freshly dug. Those who watched from afar said Clara did not scream at first. She prayed. Her voice, soft and clear, rose above the thunderclouds forming overhead. She prayed not for herself, but for her father. And even after the coffin lid was lowered, the last words the neighbors heard from beneath the earth were, "I forgive you, Papa." It was that voice, tender, unwavering, that haunted Elias in the nights that followed. He would wake, drenched in sweat, hearing her prayer echoing through the fields, and as guilt hollowed him from the inside, he began to believe something impossible, that the prayer hadn't ended with her death. It was still being whispered somewhere beneath the soil. 3 weeks after Clara Ward's burial, Miller's Creek fell into a silence so deep it felt unnatural. The townsfolk avoided the churchyard, and even the birds seemed to abandon the willow tree that swayed above her grave. Yet it was there, beneath that same tree, that the first sign appeared, the first whisper that Clara's story was not over. It was a Sunday morning when Reverend Harker found it. He had come to the cemetery alone, carrying his worn Bible and a sense of unease that refused to leave him. Kneeling by Clara's grave, he noticed the soil looked disturbed, soft, as though it had been freshly turned. The rain from the previous night couldn't have done that. Then, at the base of the wooden cross Elias had carved for her, he saw something else. 3 tiny indentations in the mud, perfectly spaced, as if made by fingertips pressing from below. The Reverend's heart pounded. He whispered a prayer, convincing himself it was just erosion, just the wind playing tricks. But then he saw it, etched faintly into the side of the cross, so light it could have been mistaken for a splinter. A single word. Cold. No one else knew about it at first. Harker covered the marks with his hand, trembling, before anyone from town arrived. He didn't want rumors spreading, not when fear already ruled every household. But that night, he couldn't sleep. He dreamed of a hand reaching through soil, pale and trembling, and a voice whispering from beneath the ground, "It's so cold." The following day, Elias Ward appeared at the church for the first time since the burial. His clothes were torn, his beard wild, his eyes red as if from sleepless nights. He sat in the last pew, silent, clutching something wrapped in a handkerchief. When the Reverend approached, Elias whispered, "She's not resting." "What do you mean?" Harker asked, trying to steady his voice. Elias opened the cloth. Inside was a small lock of blonde hair, fresh, clean, and unmistakably Clara's. "I found this on my doorstep this morning," he said. "It was wet, like it came out of the ground." The Reverend stared in disbelief. The coffin had been sealed, the grave blessed. There was no reason, no logical way for such a thing to be possible. But Elias's next words froze the air between them. "And the singing," he whispered. "You hear it too, don't you?" That night, several townsfolk claimed to have heard it. The soft, hollow hum of a hymn drifting through the cornfields. The same song Clara used to sing before she died. Some said it came from the willow tree, others from the direction of the old barn where Elias prayed. But everyone who heard it swore on their lives. The voice was not human anymore. Children woke screaming from nightmares of dirt-filled mouths. Dogs refused to approach the cemetery fence. And every morning, new symbols appeared in the mud, circles and crosses drawn by hands no one claimed to have moved. When the Reverend finally returned to the grave to bless the soil again, he brought 2 witnesses. As they stood under the willow, one of them gasped. The ground was breathing. The soil rose and fell ever so slightly, as though something beneath it was moving, slowly, rhythmically, like the chest of someone sleeping. They ran before the prayer could finish, but none of them ever forgot the faint sound that followed them through the trees, a knock, soft and deliberate, coming from beneath the earth. By the time autumn's chill settled over Miller's Creek, whispers had become dread. The cemetery was now a forbidden place, the church doors barred after dusk, and no one dared to walk near the willow after nightfall. But for Elias Ward, there was no escape from what he had done. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, sounded like the faint tapping of fingernails against wood. He began keeping a lantern lit at all hours, convinced that shadows moved differently when the light went out. Neighbors claimed they saw him pacing the yard at night, speaking softly to the ground as though negotiating with it. "She forgave me," he would mutter, "but God hasn't." Reverend Harker tried again to intervene. He rode out to Elias's farm one evening, bringing with him the town doctor, Samuel Reddick. The house reeked of damp earth and candle smoke. Every window was covered with black cloth. In the corner of the parlor sat the coffin Elias had used for his daughter, a smaller, unfinished one, made from pine instead of oak. He said it was meant for the sin still living under his roof. Dr. Reddick examined Elias's hands. They were blistered and streaked with soil. "You've been digging," he said. Elias nodded almost proudly. "I can hear her calling. She's close." The Reverend tried to reason with him, but Elias's faith had twisted into something unrecognizable. "Do you think I buried her to kill her?" he said, his voice trembling. "No, Reverend. I buried her to save her. But God has turned his face from me. He left her between worlds." Outside, the wind howled through the broken fences, carrying with it a sound that made them all freeze, a girl's voice, humming the first line of an old church hymn. Dr. Reddick swore it was only the wind, but Elias fell to his knees, crying out her name. By morning, word had spread across Miller's Creek. Some called it divine punishment, others whispered darker theories. They remembered how Elias had refused medicine, how he had ignored every plea to seek help for Clara. To many, his act was not piety, it was murder. Yet no one dared to confront him. The sheriff, when summoned, refused to investigate. "Let God deal with him," he said. "A man who buries his own blood has already damned himself." But the injustice ran deeper than one man's madness. Clara had been condemned not for her sins, but for her father's. She had been silenced because the town itself needed a scapegoat. They had watched her burial in silence. They had said nothing as her screams faded beneath the earth. And now, as strange things began to happen, livestock found mutilated, hymn books torn open, crosses shattered, they whispered that the curse was the price of their cowardice. Elias's farm soon became a place of pilgrimage for the fearful and the guilty. Some came to pray for forgiveness, others to listen for the sound beneath the soil. Many left small offerings near the willow tree, rosaries, locks of hair, children's toys, hoping to appease whatever restless spirit lingered there. One night, a widow named Margaret Tull saw Elias digging again. "She's not gone," he told her, voice ragged with desperation. "I buried her too shallow. I can still feel her warmth." When she returned at dawn, the grave was open, but the coffin was empty. From that moment on, no one saw Elias Ward in daylight again. Curtains in his house moved when there was no wind. Footprints, bare, small and wet, appeared on his porch each morning, and every evening, as the town locked its doors, a faint knock echoed across the fields. 3 slow taps, the same rhythm as a heartbeat. In Miller's Creek, justice had failed. A girl had been buried alive, a father driven to madness, and a town forever bound by silence. But what none of them yet understood was this. Clara Ward's story was not a haunting, it was a reckoning. It was early November when the first real proof appeared, proof that Clara Ward's grave was no longer her resting place. The frost had begun to harden the soil, and most of Miller's Creek believed the strange happenings would finally fade with the cold. But instead, they grew worse. Doors opened by themselves, lamps flickered even when the oil was full. And every night, the same voice sang through the valley, growing clearer, closer, as if the earth itself were learning the words. Reverend Harker had reached his breaking point. He gathered a few men, Dr. Reddick, the blacksmith Thomas Hale, and a young farmhand named Jacob Bell, and swore they would uncover the truth. "If there's evil among us," he said, gripping the cross around his neck, "then it hides in the silence we've allowed." They went to the cemetery after midnight, carrying shovels, lanterns, and prayers whispered through clenched teeth. The moon was low, and the fog hung thick over the ground like smoke from invisible fire. When they reached Clara's grave, they saw that the wooden cross had fallen, snapped clean in two, and the earth above it seemed unnaturally uneven, as if something beneath had shifted. The first strike of the shovel echoed like thunder. None of them spoke as they dug, each movement slower than the last. The smell came first, not decay, but something faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in water. Dr. Reddick paused, glancing at the Reverend, but the digging continued. Then suddenly Jacob's shovel hit wood. The coffin's lid was split down the middle, not by age or rot, but by force from the inside. The nails were bent outward. Inside, there was no body, only scraps of torn linen, a handful of hair, and two deep scratches along the wooden interior, as if made by human nails clawing for air. Thomas stumbled backward, whispering, "Dear God." But before the Reverend could respond, he noticed something else. The soil beneath the coffin was hollow, as though a tunnel had been dug from below, leading away toward the willow roots. They followed it a few feet before the ground collapsed under their weight. In the narrow opening, something pale glimmered in the lantern light, a fragment of bone, small and delicate, wrapped in what looked like the remains of a prayer cloth. But the strangest part was the writing stitched into the fabric in blood-brown thread. "Forgive me." The Reverend's hand trembled as he held it up. "She was alive," he whispered. "She woke in the dark and tried to forgive him." But before anyone could reply, a sound rose from the hollow below them, soft at first, like breath moving through a pipe, then louder, more deliberate. It wasn't the wind. It was humming, the same tune Clara used to sing. The men ran, tripping over gravestones as the lanterns swung wildly. When they reached the church, they barred the doors and sat in silence. Thomas swore he saw movement among the trees, a figure in white drifting between the tombstones. Dr. Reddick tried to calm them, insisting grief had infected their minds. But as he spoke, something knocked 3 times against the church door. Knock, pause, knock, pause, knock. No one moved. The Reverend clutched his Bible, whispering the Lord's Prayer. The knocking stopped, but a moment later, a whisper came through the keyhole. Soft, steady, unmistakably a girl's voice. Cold. When morning came, the churchyard was empty, save for one thing. Near the door, pressed into the frost, were small, barefoot prints leading away toward the river. They stopped at the edge of the water and vanished, as if the earth itself had swallowed her whole once again. From that night on, no one in Miller's Creek dared speak Clara Ward's name aloud. But everyone, in their own home, would wake at least once before dawn to the sound of faint humming drifting through the walls. Always the same tune, always moving closer. Winter fell over Miller's Creek like a shroud, yet the cold brought no peace. The river froze, but beneath its glassy surface, bubbles rose and burst as if something below still breathed. People left town quietly, abandoning homes rather than face the whispers that now filled every empty room. But for Reverend Harker, flight was impossible. The discovery at Clara's grave gnawed at his soul. Every night he saw her face when he closed his eyes, pale, dirt-streaked, her lips still mouthing the word, "Forgive." Then, one morning, as he entered the church, he found something waiting for him on the altar. It was a small wooden box, carved crudely from pine, bound shut with wire. No one in town admitted to leaving it there. When he pried it open, his breath caught. Inside lay a handful of river stones, wrapped in linen, and beneath them, a folded scrap of paper, wet and yellowed with age. He spread it out across the altar. It was a page torn from a Bible, but the ink had been smeared into strange symbols. In the center, written in careful, shaky letters, was a name, Elias Ward, and below it, another word, alive. The Reverend's blood ran cold. Elias had vanished weeks before, after the night the grave was found empty. Some said he'd drowned himself in the river. Others believed he'd gone mad and wandered into the woods. But this was a message written recently. The ink was fresh. He brought the paper to Dr. Reddick, who studied the marks beneath the text. "These aren't just stains," he said. "They're fingerprints, burned into the paper almost." He paused, lowering his voice. "Whoever touched this wasn't dead." That night, the two men went to Elias's house. Snow covered the ground in a thick, unbroken sheet, except for a narrow trail of footprints leading straight to the front door. The door itself was open, creaking gently. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of damp wood and candle wax. They found the living room untouched since their last visit, but the floorboards near the hearth had been pried open, revealing a space beneath. Inside that crawl space lay the remnants of Elias's journal, its pages warped and water-stained. Most of the writing was illegible, but one passage stood clear under the flickering lantern light. "She speaks to me through the earth. I was wrong to bury her. She was chosen, not cursed. The ground protects her now, feeds her. She will rise pure again, and I will follow." Dr. Reddick closed the book slowly. "He believed she came back," he whispered. But before they could leave, a noise echoed from behind the walls, a hollow, dragging sound, followed by 3 faint knocks. The Reverend raised his lantern. On the opposite wall, words were scrawled in charcoal, uneven and childlike. "Not her." The doctor turned pale. "If not her," he said, barely breathing, "then who?" Outside, the snow began to fall harder, erasing their footprints as they ran. From the woods behind the house came a sound unlike anything human, a long, shuddering exhale, followed by a voice so faint it seemed carried by the wind itself. "She forgave him, but not me." And that was when Reverend Harker realized the truth. The curse wasn't bound to Elias or Clara alone. Something older, something buried long before them, had been disturbed. The coffin had been her prison, but it wasn't Clara Ward who'd escaped. It was whatever had been waiting inside her. Reverend Harker and Dr. Reddick locked themselves in the church that night. The journal spread across the altar like a forbidden scripture. The storm outside howled, but it was the silence between the gusts that unnerved them most. It was in those moments of stillness that they heard it, the soft creak of footsteps on the roof above them, slow and deliberate, as though someone or something was circling the steeple. By lantern light, they examined the remaining pages of Elias Ward's journal. Several entries mentioned a ritual of returning, an old superstition that had once circulated through Appalachian settlements after the war. The ritual, Elias wrote, was meant to keep the soul tethered to the body by burying the person alive for 3 nights beneath consecrated soil. It was an act of purification meant to drive out sin. But if the soil rejects the soul, one entry read, the body returns hollow. Dr. Reddick shivered. He thought he was saving her, he muttered. But he recreated something ancient, something never meant to be done. Harker flipped to the last intact page. Scrawled across it in shaking ink was a crude diagram of the cemetery, the graves forming a circle, the willow tree at its center. Around the circle, Elias had written 3 words over and over: forgive, feed, return. When they opened the chest, Harker whispered, piecing the pattern together, it wasn't gold that gleamed inside. Beneath the journal in the box lay a small, rusted object wrapped in cloth. When unwrapped, it revealed an iron nail, blackened and twisted, the kind used to seal coffins. Attached to it by a string was a charm shaped like a child's hand. Dr. Reddick recoiled. These were never symbols of faith, he said. They're wards, protective talismans, not Christian, older. It was then that they realized Clara's grave, the house, even the church had been built within that same circle marked in the journal. Every burial for decades had unknowingly fed the pattern. Elias hadn't created the curse, he had awakened it. Outside, the storm ceased. The sudden stillness pressed against the church like a held breath, and then came a sound, a scraping, dragging noise against the wooden floor coming from beneath the altar. The Reverend froze. Slowly, he lifted the altar cloth. Beneath it, the trapdoor to the old crypt was open, its hinges torn apart. A gust of air rose from below, damp, earthy, and warm. From the darkness came a voice, low and steady, speaking words neither man could understand. Dr. Reddick leaned closer, straining to hear. Then, in a tone like rusted metal grinding against stone, the voice repeated a phrase in English. Not her, me. The lantern flickered violently. When the light steadied again, a shape stood at the far end of the church aisle, a woman's silhouette, soaked in mud, her eyes hollow but glimmering faintly, as though reflecting a distant fire. Her head tilted, her mouth moving, but no sound came. Harker dropped to his knees, whispering prayers, but Reddick couldn't look away. It's not Clara, he said. Look at her hands. The fingers were too long, the nails blackened and cracked. They left faint scorch marks on the wood as she moved. The figure stepped forward, the smell of damp soil filling the room. Then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she vanished, the church doors blowing open as if struck by a gale. Outside, the snow had stopped, the sky was clear, but etched into the fresh white ground, perfectly visible under the moonlight, were dozens of symbols forming a circle, just like in the journal. Reverend Harker fell to his knees. The circle's complete, he said. She wasn't meant to rise alone. From the woods came the faint sound of shovels striking dirt, as if unseen hands were digging in unison. The air vibrated with low humming. Dr. Reddick turned to the Reverend, his voice trembling. Whatever Elias called back, it's calling others now. If you dare to open that crypt, type I would below. The night air over Miller's Creek was thick with frost and unease. For weeks, the town had been gripped by fear that no amount of prayer could dispel. Children whispered of shadows moving beneath their beds. Adults swore they heard the soft, persistent hum of Clara's hymn drifting through empty rooms. And now, the Reverend Harker, Dr. Reddick, and a small band of townsfolk stood at the edge of the cemetery, lanterns in hand, faces pale in the moonlight, ready to confront the truth buried beneath decades of silence. The willow tree loomed overhead, its skeletal branches clawing at the sky. Beneath it, the earth had been turned again, fresh mounds of soil revealing the remnants of old graves, desecrated without mercy. Every grave seemed connected in a rough circle, just as Elias had drawn in his journal. The air smelled of wet dirt and something sweeter, almost floral, that made the hairs on the back of their necks rise. Reverend Harker stepped forward, hand trembling on his cross. "We need to see it," he whispered, voice breaking. "We need to understand what's been awakened." The others nodded, though fear rooted them to the spot. Slowly they began to dig, Not at Clara's grave, but at the back of their necks rise. Reverend Harker stepped forward, hand trembling on his cross. "We need to see it," he whispered, voice breaking. "We need to understand what's been awakened." The others nodded, though fear rooted them to the spot. Slowly they began to dig, not at Clara's grave, but at the center of the circle beneath the willow tree. Hours passed. The only sound was the scrape of shovels against earth, broken occasionally by low, distant humming that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. Then suddenly, Thomas Hale's shovel struck something solid. The men froze. It was a coffin, older than Clara's, unmarked, but sealed with thick iron nails, twisted in unnatural angles. The ground around it seemed unnaturally warm. Dr. Reddick pried the lid open. Inside lay a body, small and shrunken, wrapped in ancient linens. But the moment the lantern light touched the form, every man stepped back in horror. This was not Clara Ward. Her features were distorted, almost skeletal, and her hands were elongated, fingers bent at impossible angles. Yet somehow, the faint glow in her eyes made it unmistakable that a human soul lingered inside. Reverend Harker read aloud from the journal, voice shaking, "She was never meant to die. The soil tethers, the circle protects, but the body becomes a vessel." At that moment, the air shifted. From behind the group, a rustling sounded in the cornfield. The townsfolk turned as a figure emerged, moving with a fluid, unnatural grace. It was Clara, or what they believed to be Clara, her skin pale, her eyes hollow yet flickering with intelligence and purpose. She walked to the coffin, crouched, and with fingers that seemed to elongate even further, she reached in and pulled something free. It was a small bundle, another child's body, unnervingly similar to Clara's, wrapped in coarse linen. As she held it up, a single thought thundered in the minds of the witnesses. She had never been alone. The ritual that Elias performed didn't just awaken his daughter. It had called forth something far older, far darker, that had inhabited her body while the coffin had held her true form. The revelation struck with crushing force. Clara had been transformed, but she was no longer herself. The girl who had once sung hymns to calm the hearts of others had become a vessel for something ancient, a consciousness older than Miller's Creek itself. Every trace of innocence had been replaced by a hollow intelligence, guided by forces the townsfolk could not comprehend. Dr. Reddick stepped back, shaking. It wasn't her," he whispered. "The girl buried alive, the one we mourned, she left this world, this thing, it returned instead." And then the truth became undeniable. The circle, the talismans, the hum of hymns through the air, all were part of a pattern. Elias had unknowingly released not just Clara, but a cycle that had existed in secret for generations. Every act of burial, every whispered prayer of forgiveness, every grave dug too shallow or too deep had fed the pattern. Clara's coffin had not been a prison. It had been a seed, a catalyst. The figure moved closer to the group, and the air vibrated with energy, a low resonance that made their teeth chatter. Then, in a voice at once melodic and hollow, the girl, or the thing inhabiting her, spoke. "Forgive me, but it is not her. It has always been me." The witnesses fell silent, paralyzed. They understood at last. The girl they mourned, the daughter buried alive by her father, had been replaced. What emerged from the soil was no longer human, no longer innocent, and no longer bound by earthly morality. Miller's Creek had witnessed not just a tragedy, but the beginning of something that could not be undone. In that instant, the moon broke through the clouds, illuminating the entire circle. Symbols carved into the surrounding gravestones seemed to shimmer, etched with a light that was not natural. The wind carried the faint hum of a hymn, rising to a crescendo that made their ears ache. And then the final, chilling realization hit everyone there. The girl buried alive was gone, but whatever had returned in her place would never rest. As the villagers fled, stumbling over frozen roots and graves, Reverend Harker turned one last time. He whispered a prayer, though it felt hollow against the weight of the revelation. "This is not the end," he said. "It never was. We have unearthed something that cannot be buried again." And from the center of the circle, a voice, clear and unwavering, echoed across the fields. "I am no longer hers. I am mine." Miller's Creek would never be the same. Every grave, every willow, every wind-whipped night now carried the memory and the warning that what was buried alive could return in ways no human could ever predict. The events at Miller's Creek left scars that went far beyond the frozen soil of the cemetery. The townsfolk, once bound together by shared labor and faith, were fractured by fear and guilt. Children who had once played in the fields no longer dared to wander after dusk. Families locked their doors against unseen forces, and the memory of the girl, buried alive, became a cautionary tale whispered in trembling voices by the fire. But the story of Clara Ward, and what emerged in her place, was more than a local legend. It reflected the consequences of unchecked fear, of a society that allowed superstition and authority to override compassion. Elias Ward, a father consumed by faith, twisted into obsession, acted alone, but he was also a product of a community that had turned a blind eye to suffering, a culture that valued appearances over life. The injustice of burying a living child was magnified by the silence of those who watched and said nothing, afraid to challenge him or question tradition. Historians studying Miller's Creek note that such acts were not unique to one family or one town. Across the United States, in the decades following the Civil War, countless children and women suffered under rigid moral codes, superstition, and fear of the unknown. What happened to Clara is a reminder of how human cruelty can be masked as devotion or righteousness. It is a stark warning that morality is fragile when governed by obsession rather than empathy. The emotional weight of Clara H.'s story persists because it forces us to confront the human cost of fear. Her brief life, silenced beneath soil and secrecy, evokes both sorrow and anger, and yet her story does not end entirely in tragedy. Through the witnesses who recorded the events, the reverend, the doctor, the villagers who survived, we gain insight into a reality that was otherwise hidden. They became the keepers of a memory that should never be forgotten. The psychological impact of the events cannot be overstated. Elias Ward, haunted by his own actions, disappeared into isolation, a man consumed by guilt that no confession could ease. The townspeople carried the invisible burden of complicity. Each whisper, each glance toward the willow tree was a reminder that they had witnessed an atrocity and allowed it to occur. The air of Miller's Creek itself seemed heavier, as though the earth had absorbed not only Clara's body, but the anguish of all who had stood silent. From a broader perspective, the story underscores how societal structures and personal obsession can combine to create horrors that are both intimate and historical. In the microcosm of Miller's Creek, one father's fear, magnified by cultural superstition and social conformity, led to a crime that would echo for generations. Clara's death and the unnatural events that followed serves as a historical mirror, reflecting the dangers of abandoning reason, empathy, and human connection in favor of dogma or authority. Today we can reflect on Clara Ward not merely as a tragic figure but as a symbol. She embodies the innocent victims of unchecked power, the consequences of secrecy, and the haunting permanence of injustice. Her story urges us to listen, to observe, and to act when faced with cruelty in any form, lest silence allow fear and obsession to rewrite the lives of the vulnerable. The tragedy of Miller's Creek is not only in what happened to Clara, but in the moral awakening it demands of those who hear her story. The past is not just history, it is a warning, a testament, and a plea for humanity to recognize injustice before it buries the innocent once more. If the story of Clara Ward has left you unsettled, you are not alone. What happened in Miller's Creek is more than a tale of fear or superstition. It is a chilling reminder of what can happen when obsession, silence, and injustice intersect. But this is only one of countless hidden tragedies waiting to be uncovered. Now we want to hear from you. Do you believe that Clara truly survived her burial in some form, or was it something far older and darker that emerged instead? Type your thoughts in the comments below. Your insight could help uncover connections others might have missed. We read every comment, and your perspective could spark the next revelation in this ongoing journey into dark history. If you felt drawn into this story, consider subscribing. By doing so, you'll gain access to more investigations into forgotten crimes, mysterious disappearances, and historical events that have been erased from the pages of textbooks. We promise that every story we share is carefully researched, emotionally compelling, and designed to reveal the hidden truths lurking beneath the surface of history. And for those who stay until the very end of each video, we include exclusive insights, documents, and details that even mainstream records often omit. By subscribing and hitting the notification bell, you ensure that you're among the first to witness these revelations before anyone else. History is filled with voices that have been silenced, and through this channel, we aim to give them back a presence in the world. Clara Ward's story is a testament to that mission. By engaging in the comments, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts, you become part of a community committed to uncovering the forgotten, the hidden, and the truly dark corners of our past. So, don't remain silent. Join the conversation. Type your thoughts below, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell to make sure you never miss another story of hidden history. Your participation keeps the memory alive and ensures that these dark tales continue to be told. As the night settled once more over Miller's Creek, the wind whispered through the skeletal branches of the willow tree, carrying with it the memory of Clara Ward and the shadow of what had emerged from her grave. The townsfolk would speak of that night in hushed tones for years, but the full truth remained locked in the earth, in journals, and in the minds of those who dared to witness it. Some swore they could still hear the faint hum of her hymn, drifting through the fields long after the snow had melted, as if the girl, or the presence that had replaced her, continued to walk unseen among them. For those who followed every step of this story, it is clear that the tragedy of Miller's Creek is more than a tale of fear. It is a reflection of human obsession, societal silence, and the terrifying power of forces we barely understand. Clara Ward's life was stolen, yet her story, and the entity that emerged from her coffin, serves as a lasting testament to what happens when innocence meets darkness. History is often sanitized, the uncomfortable truths hidden behind polite phrases in textbooks or forgotten in the pages of journals. But for those willing to look deeper, to confront the shadows beneath the surface, there are always lessons to be learned. The case of Clara Ward reminds us that curiosity, vigilance, and courage are essential, not just to understand the past, but to prevent its horrors from repeating themselves. As we close this chapter, know that the story does not end here. The documents, symbols, and whispered accounts left behind hint at even darker mysteries waiting to be uncovered. Miller's Creek may have been the stage for one haunting, but there are countless other towns, graves, and hidden events where history's shadows linger, waiting for those bold enough to seek them out. If you stayed until the very end, you now carry with you a piece of that darkness and a witness to history that few have ever known. You are part of a community committed to uncovering these lost stories and ensuring they are remembered. Let that responsibility linger with you, for the past has a way of calling us back when we least expect it. And in the coming weeks, Another story will emerge from the depths of forgotten history, one filled with secrets, betrayal, and darkness so profound it will challenge everything you think you know about the past. The next mystery is already waiting, its echoes buried beneath layers of time, ready to be unearthed. Keep your curiosity alive, watch closely, and prepare yourself, because the shadows of history never truly rest, and neither do the secrets they conceal.